Welcome to Oakwood, the house that Henry Probasco built for himself in the 1860s. He came to Cincinnati around 1835, and he connected with Tyler Davison. Whether he knew him before, I don't know. But anyway, the two of them started a had a hardware business, and at that time it was like Central Hardware might be. It carried everything from building equipment to outside gardening equipment to things for children, slates, and things for the kitchen. So it was a wide variety of things. And as people went through Cincinnati on their way west, obviously they bought a lot of supplies to take with them, and this is probably one of the reasons why they made so much money in the 1850s. It was after a trip to Europe in 1856 that Henry found that the people in Europe were beginning to move out to the suburbs and build large residences, and they were doing that in Cincinnati also. So when he came back, he decided that he would follow people out to the suburbs. So in 1859, he, after buying a lot on the south side of the street, bought this lot on the north side of the street, which afforded him lovely views of the Mill Creek Valley and the hills beyond, and of course of Spring Grove Cemetery, which he was very interested in. And he proceeded to invite several architects to design houses for him. One was A.J. Davis, who was a famous architect. Another was Isaiah Rogers, who had already done a building for him in downtown Cincinnati. And another one was McLaughlin, who was another interesting Cincinnati architect. Well, he also asked William Tinsley, and William Tinsley was an Irish immigrant who had done quite a few buildings, and William Tinsley designed this building for him, and this is the one that he chose. It's a Norman, Renaissance kind of building, Romanesque in style because of the columns and the decoration. This derives from very early medieval architecture in England, which uses the rounded arch, and in the rounded arch you have the chevron molding, the zigzag kind of molding, and the capitals are carved. Well, I think my favorite part is around the bay window there in the front, because it just starts at the base and it has the capitals are carved, not particularly with realistic flowers or leaves on the columns, but as you go up you have that very realistic carving around the balcony with the nuts and that kind on the right-hand side. The left-hand side is fruit, and there's even a bird carved way at the corner, and that's very unusual. That's the only animal that is really carved on the house, is the bird. And then as you go up, there's that very fanciful sort of carved on a very romantic kind. And then at the very top you have the shield that has the initials of J.A., which is Julia Amanda Probasco, Probasco's first wife, and H.P., Henry Probasco. It has 1860 in it, and then W.T., which stood for William Tinsley, the architect. Then the tower is the other spectacular part. The stonework on that is just laid up so beautifully. And it also has interesting things at the tops of its columns. There's an open book, almost like a Bible. There's a ram's head. There's like an eye of God. The mason was Isaac Graveson, and he later did Fountain Square for Probasco. He bought 30 acres here, and it stretched from Lafayette Avenue on the south to the Miami-Erie Canal on the north. He did a lot of landscaping as he was building it to develop ravines and hills and valleys, and so he did shift the land around. And in the south part, there's a deep glen where he later planted evergreens, some yews and ferns, and this was called the Glen Garden. I do know that he had a lot of gardens, and he was very famous for his rose garden, which had some 4,000 species, or 4,000 bushes in it. He also had statuary and fountains. There's a fountain on the north side, the corner of the driveway, or not the west side. When you open that large front door and you walk in, many people are a little overwhelmed by the size and the magnitude of it. In Probasco's time, it was treated as an art gallery, probably. There were statues, marble statues that were in the hall, and someone said, and the hall was also paneled so that it was very dark. It had a single light in the center that was probably a gas light, so there wasn't a whole lot of light. And in Probasco's time, there was also a black marble mantle that was in the rear of the hall. That mantle was replaced by the wood one, which has dragons carved on it, which is rather unique. Well, this probably represents some of the most important work in the house. And one of the reasons why it is so significant and why it is an important piece of architecture is because of the wood carving which was done by Henry Fry when the house was built in 1860. And it was one of his earliest commissions, and he was very interested in doing the naturalistic kind of carving. Naturalistic would be the fruits, vegetables. There's some ears of corn and flowers that are native, most of them native to this area. The staircase probably is the best example. And Henry Fry himself said it took 3 years to carve the staircase. The staircase is carved with different vines. There's a holly, there's an ivy vine, and underneath the stairway are some beautiful tulips that are very, very nicely carved. Oh, I would think he had probably a group of people that worked with him. And there are several wood carvers that are listed in the directories at that time. But certainly he must have done the pieces that are really outstanding. Well, we don't really know who did the stone carving outside. However, much of it's very similar to what Fry did on the inside. So it's very conceivable that he at least directed people to do the outside. Well, this room was Probasco's parlor, and originally it had, the finish was of natural wood. It was not painted, but the plaster work existed up above there, and the room was used for formal occasions. The furniture in here was created by Gustav Herder for the house. And I tried to go back and look to see what the original colors were. As I scraped back, I did find there was sort of a bright robin's egg blue, I called it. But at that point, I wasn't into restoration that much, and I didn't really know what I was up to. So this turned out more of a decorated room maybe than a restored room. We worked with the Bradbury Company downtown, an interior decorator, and we came up with the color scheme because we found a rug that was very similar to this in pastel tones. And also I was influenced by a ballet which had very beautiful pastel colored costumes in the old Schubert Theater. We did know that there was some color to the flowers, particularly the sunflower had some color to it. So at some point it was probably painted with naturalistic colors in the flowers. The painter that worked with us on this was Farrell Coffey, and we both spent a long time trying to figure out the sequence of colors that we were going to use. My two favorites are the one with the tulips in and this one with the sunflowers. And some things will repeat, as I said, and some things don't, but across the ceiling there you have that tulip poplar with the leaf and the flower, and there's some tulip leaves that are carved upstairs. And that's what leads me to wonder whether Fry might have made the molds for here. But I also have to say he marbleized these columns to go with the marble that surrounds the mantel. And we painted these little cherubs. But he didn't paint any eyes in them, so my daughter, who was about 10 at the time, decided they should have eyes, and so that's why they have blue eyes. It's a very pleasant room, and when people come to visit, most people will say this is their favorite room. And it probably does strike people that way, because it is very unusual. I've never seen any plaster work quite like that. Well, this room is the study, and it originally was Mrs. Probasco's reception room. And as the picture shows, it had wallpaper that went from the floor to the ceiling and lovely furniture. There's a very lovely table that sat in the middle of the room. Well, when they took the wallpaper off of the wall, we found this painting on the wall, which shows the original painting even before Mrs. Probasco in 1880s did the room, because this is painted directly on the wall. And it's a very unusual sort of color scheme, and it went all the way up as green with a little red border at the top. Don't know what how the ceiling was painted at that point. In the second renovation in 1900, this probably was Mr. Riekert's old place where he brought his men friends, and maybe there was even a billiard table under that light because it is looped up on a chain. It could be lower. Well, the mantel is a very, very interesting part of this room. As I said, it was put in 1900, and we know that from pictures that we have. And it lends a very masculine, bold look. And I have a theory, which I do not know whether it's correct or not, but these rocks don't look very much like the rocks that we have around Cincinnati. And Mr. Riekert had a hunting lodge up in Wisconsin, and so I've sort of theorized that they moved these rocks down from Wisconsin to be used in the room here. When we started this room in 1991, which was the last room that we have done, we knew we couldn't make it into a feminine-looking room because we had this monstrous fireplace that had been put in 1900. So we decided that probably would be better to go with a 1900 look, because we had the fireplace, we had the light, and we had the side lights. So the shelving had been removed, but there was a piece of it up in the attic. So we got the shelving out, and we had that recreated. So most of that is new. And we fortunately found a wallpaper that goes well. We wanted the flowers to be, well, we thought naturalistic, but somehow blue morning glories up there didn't cut the cake very well. So we decided that the gold, and the young man who did this, Jeff Sutherland, came up with that color scheme with using the red, which came from the fireplace somewhat, and then the gold and the green. And when the gold and the green went on, it just made that come alive. Now the centerpiece was his creation to put something around the center light, because there was nothing there. The light just hung down bare. Now today we use this room as our living room and spend quite a bit of time in here. In Probasco's day, it was his library and his pride and joy, for he had a collection of books that were of rare and unusual. He had a folio of Shakespeare, he had first edition Bibles, and he had fancy bindings, and he enjoyed showing them to all his friends. It was furnished with a library table in the center and a comfortable chair and a couch, and of course all the books. The library at that point had shelves that went all the way up to the ceiling in great arches. And the only remaining part of that today is the molding that goes around the ceiling. Now, the ceiling that you see today is a reproduction of what was there, but in the picture and remaining on the ceiling itself was evidence of this ceiling, which was recreated for the room. Probasco sold his library in 1890 to the Newberry Library in Chicago, and it formed the beginning of their collection. In 1900, this room underwent major renovation under Mr. Riekert. And one of the things that was done was this mantle was put in, which is a very massive mantle. And as you can see, it had a classical element to it with the torch and the waving banner there. The banner also has oak leaves in it, which indicates a way of tying in the old carving with the new carving. The other thing it has are acanthus leaves on the little corbels, and that also ties into other carving that is around from the 1900 carving. Well, here we have the dining room, and this is a very interesting room because it shows the contrast between what was here in 1860 and what came later in 1900. In 1860, the arches in the bay window, you can see the wonderful carving of fruit that's on either side of it. But in 1900, when Mr. Riekert moved in, why we have this kind of a carving, which is very much more stylized and with the gargoyles. And it was said that this room was done in the Italian manner, and maybe that's why the gargoyles and the shields that you see were used. And at this time also the light fixtures were put in, and they also followed the same pattern as the wood carving, with the shields and the very fancy furbelows. I like to think that it was Fry's son, William Fry, that came the second time to do this carving. I have no proof of that, but it's very much like carving that he did do, and it'd be nice to know whether that he had followed in his father's footsteps here. And we also know that the ceiling had a different pattern on it, and it had a pattern that had a basket of fruit and some trailing ribbony things, and the center was put in a grid pattern so it looked almost like tile. And we know that because when these panels were repaired, there was a panel that fell down and we could actually see what was underneath it, and that's painted directly on the plaster, so we know that that was probably original. And we also know that the tapestry on the wall came in 1900, and we know that it was at one time very brightly colored because under the lights it had not faded. It was blues and greens and tans and very naturalistic looking. Well, as you come up the staircase, you enter into a large octangular hall, and all the bedrooms radiate off that hall. And the hall probably functioned in Probasco's time as an upstairs sitting room, because there is a picture that exists that shows some chairs sitting around and also some children's furniture. I don't know quite the use that Riekert might have made of it, but I know he had some part of his collection here because there were two suits of armor in the niches that are out in the hall. I don't know what anybody else had in there, but I've graduated to the 20th century because I have plastic plants that will remain. It's different. It's actually made of stone, and it supports the tower. And carved on there are some of the same symbols as outside over the porte cochere in that diamond-shaped thing. And there are some fleur-de-lis and the Scotch thistle and rose. And it's then finished off so it looks like wood. Very deceiving. Well, this room is the room that we use as our master bedroom. And we redid it in 1970, or early 1970s. And we used a lot of family furniture here. The Victorian bed and these chairs and the dressers were all family pieces. When we did it in the early 70s, the Victorian borders and Victorian papers were not as available as they are today. So again, Bob Nowicki worked with us, and we used this border, which is a very classical border, and we used dark blue paint to make it look a little wider than it was. Well, I would guess that this room probably was used by Mrs. Probasco because it kind of has a feminine look to it. Mr. Probasco had, for his room, the northeast bedroom. And in that room, you have a lovely view overlooking the valley and a nice bay window. And I know that he had that bedroom because he wrote back a letter after they collected Oriental rugs, and he said he's sending back a large Oriental rug, which he once put in his bedroom, and he says it's the northeast bedroom. So that's how I know that fact. I do not know how it was decorated, however. The three front rooms did connect, and perhaps the middle one, which is smaller, was used as a dressing room. And it makes a nice suite across here. Probasco married a Julia Amanda Carrington, and that first marriage they had no children. But when they built this house, there were 5 bedrooms in the main part, and I would suspect that they did have out-of-town company and would have used it for that purpose. The second marriage that Probasco had to Grace Sherlock, they did have 2 children. I had Grace and then Henry Jr. So some of the rooms had to be used by the children. Henry says that he always thought horticulture, his collections, and philanthropy were his most important things, but now he found his children to be much more precious. Isn't that a wonderful thing to say? After this bachelor, he was 67 years old when he married the second time. I've always loved dolls, so it came naturally to collect them. And the dolls that are in here are perhaps my best dolls. And the one sitting next to me here is Sylvia. Sylvia was given to my mother when she was 3 years old. She had it fixed for me when I was 3, and then she fixed it for my daughter, Susie, when she was 3. So she's a very precious one. And she also has real hair that belonged to the family. That's a combination of hair from the family. And some of the other dolls also were family dolls. Some of them I've collected. A few of them other people have given to me to take care of, which I prize. And some of them were my daughter's dolls. So I have a real collection, and I love them all. Well, another collection that we have, my husband and I both do, have a collection of pigs. And this started when we were first married. And he brought back a small little pink pig, and pretty soon other people were giving us pigs, and pretty soon I was finding wonderful pigs. There's a west wing that goes over the kitchen dining room area, and there are some smaller bedrooms back there that probably were used by the main people that helped in the house, like the butler and the main maid. Well, the tower was probably built as a belvedere, kind of a place to come and have the view of the countryside. It also probably functioned as a way for the hot air to escape if all the windows were open. To the north, you see Spring Grove Cemetery, which Mr. Probasco was president of until his death. You see to the west, you see North Side and the Western Hills. To the east, you see the Mill Creek Valley and the industrial park, Procter & Gamble and the chemical plants. But this was a very scenic spot up here with, they mentioned the railroad going through the valley, and that was added to the scenery, and of course Spring Grove's Avenue, where they was one of the few paved streets at the time, and they could ride their carriages and horses down there. So it was part of the added view that was the picturesque view of the area. When we came, the tower probably hadn't had any attention for quite a long time, and the woodwork was black and dried out. The double-hung windows, even though the Carols had replaced them in the 1960s, they too were beginning to rot out, and the woodwork along the wainscoting was also very black and dark. So the original chandelier was just a round iron pipe that probably was gas to begin with, and then had been electrified. And I could not find a chandelier that was proper for the spot. So my husband Bill created that. It was the house that Henry Probasco built, and he did give the fountain, so it has that historical significance. Also, because of the architecture of the house and the people that were used to create it, Henry Fry, the Herder brothers, and Francis Pedretti, who was supposedly did the ceilings, it has significance from the art historian's point of view and from the decorative arts point of view. It's been a wonderful house to live in and to have the children grow up in, to have family affairs, events in.